The Flannan Isles Lighthouse Keepers, the mystery of the men who vanished into thin air. 3 men, an isolated lighthouse, a storm-battered island 20 miles from civilization. When a relief ship arrived on December 26, 1900, all 3 lighthouse keepers had vanished without a trace. No bodies, no goodbye, no explanation. The table was set for a meal that was never eaten. 2 of the 3 waterproof coats were missing. The clocks had stopped, and carved into the edge of reality itself was a mystery that has haunted investigators for over a century. Tonight, on the Obscure Hour, we're traveling to the Flannan Isles, where 3 experienced men disappeared from a locked and secured lighthouse, leaving behind only questions and a logbook that may contain the key to everything. This is the story of the most disturbing maritime mystery in British history, and the theories that still can't fully explain what happened on that God-forsaken rock in the North Atlantic. You've just entered the Obscure Hour. Brace yourself for what's ahead, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a mystery. What happened December 26, 1900? The steamship Hesperus approached the Flannan Isles, a cluster of uninhabited rocks off the western coast of Scotland. Captain James Harvey was making a routine relief voyage, bringing supplies and a replacement keeper to the lighthouse that had been built just 1 year earlier. But as the ship drew closer, something was wrong. There was no flag flying from the flagstaff, no preparations for their arrival, no sign of life at all. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse was one of the most remote postings in the Northern Lighthouse Board's network. Built on Eilean Mòr, the largest of the 7 islands, it stood 150 feet above sea level, its light visible for 24 miles in every direction. It was a critical navigation point for ships traveling through the treacherous waters between Scotland and the Outer Hebrides. 3 men were stationed there. James Ducat, the principal keeper, age 43. Thomas Marshall, the second assistant, age 28. And Donald MacArthur. Donald MacArthur was supposed to be there, but he'd been granted shore leave for family reasons. In his place was William MacArthur. Actually, that's not right either. Let me get this straight, because the names matter. The 3 men who disappeared were James Ducat, the principal keeper, Thomas Marshall, the second assistant, and Donald MacArthur, the occasional keeper, who had replaced the regular keeper, Joseph Moore, who was on shore leave. Actually, I need to correct this one more time, because the historical record is precise, and this detail is crucial. The 3 men who vanished were James Ducat, age 43, the principal keeper, Thomas Marshall, age 28, the second assistant, and Donald MacArthur, age 40, the occasional keeper. The man who discovered they were gone was Joseph Moore, age 31, who was arriving as the relief keeper. On December 26, 1900, Joseph Moore climbed the steps to the lighthouse entrance. The door was closed but unlocked. He went inside. The kitchen was empty, cold. The clock on the wall had stopped. The fire was out, and had been for some time. On the table, the remains of a meal, or rather, preparations for a meal that had never been eaten. Mòr called out. His voice echoed through the lighthouse tower. No response. He climbed to the light room at the top. Everything was in order. The lamp had been cleaned and refilled, ready for lighting. But it hadn't been lit in days. Mòr rushed back down and went outside to search the island. He checked the storage areas, the landing platforms, the pathways. He found that 2 of the 3 sets of waterproof oilskin coats and boots were missing from their hooks. James Ducat and Thomas Marshall had apparently gone outside, but Donald MacArthur's coat remained hanging inside. If there had been an emergency requiring all 3 men to leave the lighthouse, why would MacArthur go out without his protective gear in December in the North Atlantic? Joseph Mòr returned to the Hesperus and reported to Captain Harvey. They assembled a search party. For hours, they combed every inch of the tiny island. Eilean Mòr is only about 39 acres. You can walk around it in less than an hour. There are no trees, no caves large enough to hide in, no shelter of any kind except the lighthouse itself. The 3 men were not on the island. The Northern Lighthouse Board launched an official investigation. Superintendent Robert Muirhead traveled to the Flannan Isles and examined every detail. What he found would only deepen the mystery. The lighthouse logbook contained entries up until December 15th, 11 days before the men were discovered missing. But here's where things get strange. According to what's been reported, over the years, the logbook supposedly contained increasingly frantic entries about a terrible storm, with Thomas Marshall reporting that James Ducat had been very quiet and Donald MacArthur had been crying. But we need to be very careful here, because this detail has been disputed by historians who have examined the actual records. What we know for certain is this: the last log entry was made on December 15th. The lighthouse light was reported missing by passing ships starting on December 15th at night. So whatever happened to the 3 men, it happened on or around December 15th, 1900. A full 11 days before anyone discovered they were gone. The physical evidence found on the island painted a picture of violence. But violence from what? The West Landing platform, where supplies were brought ashore, showed significant damage. A large wooden box that normally stored ropes and equipment had been washed away or destroyed. Iron railings had been bent and twisted. A massive iron cleat used for securing boats had been torn from its position, wrenched from solid rock. The damage was centered at a platform that was 70 feet above sea level. Whatever force had struck the West Landing, it had been powerful enough to destroy metal and stone at a height that should have been safe from all but the most extreme waves. But here's what made investigators pause. The East Landing, which was lower and more exposed, showed no damage at all, and the weather reports from that period were inconsistent with the kind of storm that could cause such destruction. Experienced lighthouse keepers, men who understood the sea and its dangers, men who were trained never to leave the lighthouse unattended, who knew that even in an emergency, at least one keeper must always remain on station. All three gone. No bodies were ever recovered. No wreckage. No trace of what happened in those final moments. The Flannan Isles Mystery became immediate news across Britain and beyond. It captured the public imagination in a way few disappearances had before. Perhaps because lighthouses represented safety and civilization in a dangerous world, or perhaps because the circumstances were so utterly inexplicable. The Northern Lighthouse Board's official position was that the men had been swept away by a rogue wave while attempting to secure equipment at the West Landing during a storm. But that explanation, it doesn't quite fit all the evidence. And so the mystery has persisted for over 124 years. What happened to James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur on December 15th, 1900? Documented details. Let's examine what we actually know, detail by detail, building the most complete picture possible from the historical record. The lighthouse and the island. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse was completed in December 1899, making it brand new when the disappearance occurred. It was designed by David Allen Stevenson, part of the famous Stevenson Lighthouse engineering family. The structure was built to the highest standards of the time, constructed from solid granite, equipped with state-of-the-art lighting equipment. Eilean Mòr, the island where the lighthouse stands, is the largest of 7 islands in the Flannan Group. The islands are located about 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides. They're also known as the 7 Hunters. The local population had long regarded the Flannan Isles with superstitious dread. Ancient folklore spoke of them as a place where people disappeared, where phantom birds shrieked in the night, where the normal rules of reality didn't quite apply. Shepherds from Lewis, who would bring their flocks to graze on the islands in summer, would perform protective rituals before landing. Whether this folklore has any bearing on what happened in 1900 is impossible to say, but it adds a layer of cultural context to the mystery. The lighthouse required 3 keepers on station at all times, with a 4th keeper on shore leave in rotation. The duty periods were typically 6 weeks on the island, 2 weeks on shore. The men lived in cramped quarters inside the lighthouse tower, sharing cooking and maintenance duties. The 3 men. James Ducat was the most experienced of the 3. At 43, he had been a lighthouse keeper for over 20 years. He'd served at multiple stations throughout Scotland and was known as steady, professional, and unflappable. He was married with 4 children, His wife would later say he'd never expressed any concerns about the Flannan Isles posting. Thomas Marshall was 28. He'd been in the lighthouse service for several years and was considered promising. Reports describe him as physically strong and capable. He came from a family with maritime connections and had grown up around the sea. Donald MacArthur was 40. He was what was called an occasional keeper, meaning he filled in when one of the permanent keepers was on leave. He'd been in the service for many years and had an exemplary record. He was known as quiet and deeply religious. These weren't novices. They were professional keepers with training and experience. They knew the dangers. They knew the protocols, the timeline. Let's establish exactly what happened and when. December 7th, 1900. The relief ship brings Joseph Mòr to shore, and he begins his leave period. James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur are left on the island for their duty rotation. December 15th, 1900 evening. The steamer Arctur passes the Flannan Isles and notes in its log that the lighthouse light is not operating. This is the first indication that something is wrong, though at the time it's assumed to be a temporary equipment failure. December 15th through December 25th, several other ships pass the Flannan Isles and report the light is dark. Concerns are raised, but the weather has been poor, making it impossible to send a relief vessel. December 26th, 1900, morning. The Hesperus, carrying Joseph Mòr and Captain James Harvey, approaches the island. No flag is flying. No signs of life. When Mòr goes ashore and enters the lighthouse, he finds it empty. December 26th, afternoon. A search of the island reveals no trace of the three men. December 29th, 1900. Superintendent Robert Muirhead arrives to conduct the official investigation. So we can establish with near certainty that the disappearance occurred on December 15th, since that's when the light stopped operating and ships began reporting it missing. The scene inside the lighthouse. Joseph Mòr's description of what he found inside has been documented in multiple sources. Let's go through it room by room. The entrance door was closed but not locked. This was unusual. Regulations required that the door be kept locked at all times, unless keepers were actively moving supplies. In the kitchen, the table was set. Some sources say there was a meal partially eaten, others that preparations for a meal had been made but not completed. The chair nearest the door had been knocked over. The fire in the stove was out and cold. The beds in the sleeping quarters were unmade. Personal belongings were undisturbed. The men's clothing, except for the 2 missing sets of oilskins, remained in their proper places. In the light room, at the top of the tower, everything was in perfect order. The lamp had been cleaned, filled with oil, and prepared for lighting. The wick was trimmed. The lens was spotless. It was ready to be lit at sunset, but no one had lit it. The logbook was closed. The last entry was dated December 15th and contained routine notes about maintenance and weather conditions. Some sources have claimed that later entries described a fierce storm and showed signs of distress, but historians examining the actual logbook have found no evidence of this. This discrepancy is important. The myth of the frantic final log entries has become part of the popular story, but it appears to have been invented or embellished by later writers. The real logbook entries were routine and gave no indication of trouble. The scene outside, the West Landing area, where supplies were brought ashore, showed extensive damage. This landing was located about 70 feet above sea level on the western side of the island, facing the open Atlantic. A large wooden crate used for storing ropes had been destroyed or washed away. The iron railings leading down to the landing had been bent and twisted. Most dramatically, an iron cleat used for securing ropes, which had been fixed into solid rock, had been torn from its position. The turf above the landing had been ripped away in places, as if by tremendous force. Rocks had been scattered, but here's what's crucial. The east landing, which was lower and more exposed to the prevailing weather, showed no damage whatsoever. The equipment stored there was undisturbed. The ropes were neatly coiled. Everything was exactly as it should be. This asymmetry is difficult to explain if a general storm caused the damage. The missing coats. 2 of the 3 sets of oilskins and boots were missing. These were heavy waterproof coats and knee-high rubber boots that keepers wore when working outside in wet conditions. The sets belonging to James Ducat and Thomas Marshall were gone. Donald MacArthur's set remained hanging on its hook inside the lighthouse. Think about what this implies. If all 3 men left the lighthouse together, why would MacArthur not take his protective gear? December in the North Atlantic is brutal. Wind chill can be deadly. The spray from the sea is constant. No experienced keeper would venture outside in those conditions without protection, unless he left in a desperate hurry. The weather question. The official investigation tried to determine what the weather conditions were around December 15th. This proved difficult because the Flannan Isles themselves had no weather station, and the keepers who might have recorded the conditions were gone. Weather reports from surrounding areas showed that December 15th was indeed stormy, but not exceptionally so. The winds were strong, but not hurricane force. The seas were rough, but not beyond what the lighthouse was designed to withstand. However, there was evidence of a more severe storm on December 17th, 2 days after the men disappeared. Could the damage to the West Landing have been caused by this later storm? And if so, does that change our understanding of what happened? Some researchers have suggested that the men disappeared in one incident, and the landing was damaged in a separate storm afterward. This would explain why the evidence seems contradictory. Point. The captain's report. Captain James Harvey of the Hesperus provided a detailed account to the Northern Lighthouse Board. He described approaching the island and feeling uneasy when he saw no flag flying and no signs of activity. When Joseph Mòr went ashore alone and returned with the news that the lighthouse was empty, Harvey sent a search party. They looked for hours, calling out the men's names, checking every possible location. Harvey noted in his report that the sea around the island was calm on December 26th. The weather was clear. If the men had been swept away days earlier, there should have been some trace, debris, damage to personal items, something. But there was nothing. The superintendent's investigation. Robert Muirhead was the superintendent of lighthouses for the Northern Lighthouse Board. He arrived 3 days after the disappearance was discovered and conducted a thorough investigation. Muirhead's report is the primary source document for most of what we know. He measured the damage to the west landing. He examined the lighthouse from top to bottom. He interviewed Joseph Mòr and Captain Harvey. He tried to reconstruct what might have happened. His official conclusion was that the men had seen a massive wave approaching the west landing, where equipment was in danger of being damaged. Ducat and Marshall rushed out to secure the equipment, wearing their oilskins. MacArthur, watching from the lighthouse entrance without his coat, saw them in danger and rushed out to help. A massive wave swept all three into the sea. It's a logical explanation. It accounts for the missing coats, the damage to the landing, and the disappearance of all three men. But it doesn't account for everything. The problems with the official explanation. If Ducat and Marshall went to secure equipment at the west landing, they would have closed and locked the door behind them. That was standard procedure. But the door was found closed and unlocked. If MacArthur was watching his colleagues from the lighthouse and saw them in danger, would he really rush out without taking even a moment to grab his coat? These men were trained to never act rashly. Caution was drilled into them. And perhaps most troubling, why would experienced keepers be attempting to secure equipment during a storm severe enough to create waves that could reach 70 feet above sea level? The protocols were clear. In such conditions, you stay inside. Equipment can be replaced. Lives cannot. There's also the question of timing. If this happened on December 15th during a storm, and the damage to the landing was caused by that same storm, why do weather reports suggest the worst weather didn't arrive until December 17th? What the locals said. In the weeks following the disappearance, stories began to circulate among the people of Lewis. Some claimed to have had premonitions. Others spoke of seeing phantom lights or hearing strange sounds from the direction of the Flannan Isles. These accounts are difficult to verify and were probably influenced by the superstitious reputation the islands already had. But they became part of the folklore surrounding the mystery. One detail that emerged later: a shepherd who had been on one of the nearby islands claimed he saw a small boat near Eilean Mòr on December 15th. But this was never confirmed, and no boat was found. The aftermath. The lighthouse was automated in the 1970s and is now operated remotely. No keepers have been stationed there since. The building remains, standing as a monument to the 3 men who vanished. In 1912, a memorial was erected at Briescleet on the Isle of Lewis, listing the names of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. Their families never received closure. No bodies, no graves, just names on stone, and an unsolved mystery. The Northern Lighthouse Board changed some of its procedures following the incident. The requirement that at least 1 keeper always remain inside during emergencies was reinforced. Additional safety equipment was provided to remote stations, but no official explanation has ever fully satisfied everyone who examines the evidence. Theories. For over a century, researchers, historians, and amateur detectives have proposed explanations for what happened to the 3 lighthouse keepers. Let's examine the main theories, from the most conventional to the most speculative. Theory 1. The rogue wave. This is the official explanation, and it remains the most widely accepted among historians and maritime experts. The theory proposes that James Ducat and Thomas Marshall went to the West Landing to secure equipment during rough seas. While they were working, they saw an unusually large wave approaching. Donald MacArthur, watching from the lighthouse, saw his colleagues in danger and rushed out to help without taking time to put on his oilskins. A massive wave, possibly a rogue wave, swept all 3 men into the Atlantic. Rogue waves are real phenomena. They're waves that are more than twice the size of surrounding waves, appearing seemingly out of nowhere. They can occur even during relatively calm conditions, when waves from different directions intersect and combine. Ships have been damaged or sunk by rogue waves throughout history. The physics supports this. A large enough wave could absolutely reach the West Landing at 70 feet above sea level. The damage to the iron railings and rock cleat demonstrates tremendous force, consistent with a major wave strike. The timeline works. If this happened on December 15th during deteriorating weather conditions, it explains why the light wasn't lit that evening and why ships began reporting it missing. The psychology fits. These were dedicated professionals. If Ducat and Marshall were in danger, MacArthur would have reacted instinctively to help them, even at risk to himself. In a crisis, training and instinct can override caution. But here are the problems with this theory. First, the door. Why was it unlocked? If 2 men went out to work at the landing, standard procedure was to lock the door behind them. If MacArthur then rushed out to help, would he have paused to unlock it first? Or was it already unlocked for some reason? Second, the east landing shows no damage. If seas were violent enough to create a wave that reached 70 feet high on one side of the island, why was the lower, more exposed, east landing completely undamaged? Third, the weather records. While December 15th was stormy, reports suggest it wasn't catastrophically so. The truly severe weather appears to have arrived on December 17th. Could the landing have been damaged by a later storm after the men were already gone? Fourth, why would experienced keepers be outside working in conditions dangerous enough to produce such waves? The protocols existed specifically to prevent this kind of risk-taking. The rogue wave theory is plausible, but it requires accepting that 3 professional keepers made a series of decisions that contradicted their training. Theory 2. The double storm. This variation on the official theory attempts to address some of the inconsistencies. The proposal is that 2 separate events occurred. On December 15th, in moderately rough but manageable weather, the 3 men all went outside for some reason that didn't seem dangerous at the time. Perhaps they heard something. Perhaps they thought they saw a boat in distress. Perhaps there was damage to the lighthouse exterior that needed immediate repair. While they were outside, something unexpected happened. Perhaps a rogue wave, smaller than the one that later damaged the landing, but still powerful enough. Or perhaps one man fell, and the others tried to help him, and the sea took all 3. Then, on December 17th, a more severe storm arrived and caused the dramatic damage to the west landing that investigators found. This would explain why the damage seems disproportionate to the weather conditions on the day of the disappearance. This theory resolves some issues. It explains the unlocked door. All 3 men left together, so no one remained to lock it behind them. It explains why MacArthur wasn't wearing his coat. Maybe the conditions didn't seem to warrant it initially, but it creates a new problem. Why would all 3 men leave the lighthouse at the same time, violating the fundamental rule that one keeper must always remain on station? Theory 3. Murder-suicide. This is a darker theory that's been proposed by some researchers, examining the psychological dynamics of isolated living. The Flannan Isles posting was incredibly isolated. 3 men, confined to a small space, dealing with the psychological stress of being cut off from civilization, in constant darkness during December in Scotland. Tension could build. Arguments could escalate. The theory suggests that one of the keepers suffered a psychological break, killed one or both of his colleagues, and then either killed himself or fled the island somehow. The body or bodies might have been thrown into the sea. The perpetrator might have followed them in or escaped by boat. Evidence that could support this, the knocked-over chair in the kitchen, suggests a sudden violent movement. The missing men left no note, no goodbye. The door was unlocked, suggesting someone left in a hurry or distress. The problem with this theory is that there's no evidence of violence inside the lighthouse. No blood, no signs of struggle, no damage to the interior beyond that one chair. Also, where would they go? Eilean Mòr is tiny. If someone murdered his colleagues and then fled, where did he flee to? There was no boat at the island. The nearest land was 20 miles away, across treacherous seas. And psychologically, does it fit? These were experienced keepers. They'd all worked in isolation before. There were no known conflicts between them. All three were described as stable, professional men. Most serious historians give this theory little credence, but it persists because it's one of the few explanations that accounts for all three men being gone. Theory 4. The foreign vessel. This theory emerged from the geopolitical context of 1900. Britain was in the middle of the Second Boer War. Tensions with other European powers were high. What if a foreign vessel was involved somehow? The theory proposes that a ship approached the Flannan Isles, perhaps damaged and needing help, or perhaps involved in espionage or smuggling. The keepers went to render assistance or investigate. Something went wrong. The crew of the vessel either killed the keepers deliberately or accidentally caused their deaths, then fled to avoid an international incident. The evidence? Well, that shepherd who claimed to see a boat near the island on December 15th. The fact that all three men appear to have left the lighthouse together, which they might do if signaling to a ship or preparing to render assistance. The complete disappearance of the bodies, which would make sense if they were taken aboard a vessel. The problem is that there's no solid evidence any other vessel was involved. The supposed sighting of a boat was never confirmed. No wreckage or debris from another ship was found. In 1900, if a foreign vessel had killed British lighthouse keepers, it would have been a massive scandal when discovered. This theory is speculative and lacks supporting evidence, but it offers an explanation for why all three men might have left the lighthouse voluntarily. Theory 5. The psychological spiral. Some researchers have focused on the psychological state that the logbook entries allegedly revealed, even though modern examination of the actual logbook suggests those dramatic entries may have been invented by later writers. Let's examine this theory on its merits. The idea is that one or more of the keepers experienced a severe psychological episode triggered by the isolation, the December darkness, the constant sound of wind and waves, and possibly shared delusion or folie à plaisir. In this state, they might have made irrational decisions. They might have all gone outside in response to a hallucination or delusion. They might have believed something was happening that wasn't real. There are documented cases of lighthouse madness throughout history. The isolation could drive men to paranoia, depression, or psychosis. The Flannan Isles had a supernatural reputation that might have preyed on their minds. But again, these were experienced professionals. All three simultaneously having a psychotic break is unlikely. And even in such a state, how exactly did they disappear? Did they walk into the sea deliberately? That would be a murder-suicide scenario with no evidence. This theory might explain irrational decision-making, but it still doesn't explain the physical disappearance. Theory 6. The Sea Cave. This is a more recent theory based on a closer examination of the island's geology. Some researchers have proposed that Eilean Mòr might have sea caves or underground passages that weren't fully mapped in 1900. The theory suggests the men went into such a cave for some reason. Perhaps investigating damage, searching for something, or taking shelter. The cave flooded during high tide or a storm surge, trapping them. Their bodies might still be in an unexplored cave system. This would explain why no bodies were found on the surface. It would explain why all three men might have gone together. It would explain the complete disappearance. The problem is that Eilean Mòr has been thoroughly explored since 1900. No significant cave systems have been found. The island is mostly solid rock with no complex underground passages. Unless there's a cave with an entrance below the waterline that hasn't been discovered, this theory doesn't hold up. Theory 7. The Accident Cascade. This theory proposes a series of accidents, each one triggering the next. Perhaps Ducat and Marshall went to check the west landing. A wave knocked one of them into the water. The other tried to help and was also swept away. MacArthur, watching or hearing what happened, rushed out without his coat to try to save them and was also taken by the sea. Or perhaps the sequence was different. Maybe MacArthur went out alone for some mundane reason, without his coat, because he only expected to be out briefly. He got into trouble. Ducat and Marshall heard his cries, grabbed their oilskins, rushed out, and all three ended up in the water. This type of cascading emergency is not uncommon. One incident leads to another, and suddenly everyone is at risk. Rescuers become victims. What started as a minor problem becomes a catastrophe. This theory has the advantage of explaining both the missing coats and the psychological behavior. Professional keepers might break protocol if they believed a colleague's life was in immediate danger. The weakness is that we have no evidence of the initial accident that triggered the cascade, and it still requires accepting that experienced men made a series of poor decisions. Why people talk about it. The Flannan Isles Mystery has endured in public consciousness for 124 years. It's inspired poems, books, films, songs, and countless discussions. But why? What is it about this particular disappearance that resonates so deeply? The violation of safety. Lighthouses represent safety. They're beacons that guide ships away from danger. They're symbols of human ingenuity, protecting us from nature's chaos. The lighthouse is where you're supposed to be safe. When something terrible happens at a lighthouse, it's a violation of that fundamental symbolism. It's like a locked door, failing to keep danger out. The very place that should be safest becomes the site of tragedy. This psychological dissonance is deeply unsettling. If three men aren't safe in a brand new, solidly built lighthouse, where are we safe? The mystery taps into our primal need for sanctuary. We want to believe that civilization can protect us, that walls and doors and lights can keep the darkness at bay. The Flannan Isles reminds us that maybe they can't. The complete disappearance. Human beings struggle with the absence of closure. We're pattern-seeking creatures. We need narratives that have beginnings, middles, and ends. We need to know what happened. The Flannan Isles give us no ending, no bodies, no witnesses, no explanation that fully satisfies, just absence. This is psychologically frustrating in a way that a tragedy with a known cause isn't. If the men had been found dead, if there was clear evidence of what killed them, it would be sad but comprehensible. The complete disappearance leaves a narrative void that our minds keep trying to fill. Some researchers have noted that unsolved mysteries with this kind of absolute absence are particularly likely to persist in cultural memory. We can't stop thinking about them because we haven't been able to file them away with a satisfactory explanation. It's like an itch we can't scratch. The story isn't complete, so we keep returning to it. The professionals who failed. These weren't sailors who made a mistake. They weren't tourists who underestimated danger. They were professional lighthouse keepers with years of experience and extensive training. If anyone should have been able to handle the situation on Eilean Mòr, it was James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. They knew the risks. They knew the protocols. They had survived other storms, other postings, other dangers. And yet, something got them. This is terrifying because it suggests that expertise isn't enough. Knowledge isn't enough. Experience isn't enough. You can do everything right and still be overwhelmed. In our modern world, we like to believe that proper training and following procedures will keep us safe. The Flannan Isles challenges that belief. It suggests that sometimes, despite all preparation, we're still vulnerable. The isolation factor. In 1900, the Flannan Isles was one of the most isolated postings in the British lighthouse system, 20 miles from the nearest inhabited land. No radio communication. No quick way to get help. Just 3 men on a rock in the Atlantic. Modern audiences find this isolation both fascinating and horrifying. In our hyper-connected world, true isolation is increasingly rare. Most of us are always reachable, always trackable, always connected. The idea of being genuinely cut off, of something happening, and no one knowing for 11 days, it's almost unimaginable now. But that isolation also makes the mystery more tractable in a way. There were only 3 men on a small island. Whatever happened should be understandable. The variables are limited. And yet we still can't solve it. This creates cognitive dissonance. Simple scenario, inexplicable outcome, the ghost story elements. The Flannan Isles has elements that make it feel like a classic ghost story. The isolated location, the supernatural folklore surrounding the islands, the sudden, unexplained disappearance, the eerie scene inside the lighthouse with its stopped clocks and uneaten meal. These are the building blocks of Gothic horror. If you were writing a ghost story, you'd include exactly these details. The mystery occupies an interesting space between fact and folklore. It's a real historical event, documented and investigated, but it has the narrative structure of fiction. This makes it particularly compelling for storytelling. Writers and filmmakers have been drawn to the Flannan Isles for exactly this reason. It's real, which gives it weight and credibility. But it's mysterious enough that you can explore imaginative possibilities without contradicting the evidence. The unsettling details. Certain specific details of the Flannan Isles case have a particular power to unsettle. The knocked-over chair. What does that signify? A sudden alarm? A struggle? Someone jumping up in shock? The missing coats. 2 gone, 1 remaining. It speaks to haste, to decisions made in different states of mind, to something that happened in stages rather than all at once. The stopped clocks. Time itself frozen at the moment of whatever happened. The perfectly prepared lamp that was never lit. Work done in expectation of a normal evening that never came. These details are vivid and specific. They fire the imagination. They feel like clues, but clues that don't quite add up to an answer. Our brains are wired to find these kinds of details significant. We assume they must mean something, and when we can't figure out what they mean, it creates a kind of narrative tension that doesn't resolve. The cultural moment. The Flannan Isles disappearance occurred right at the turn of the century. In December 1900, the old world was ending. The new world was beginning. It was a moment of technological optimism. Humanity building lighthouses on remote rocks, conquering nature, spreading civilization. And then 3 men vanished from one of those beacons of progress. There's something symbolically powerful about that timing. The 20th century began with a mystery that technology couldn't solve. It was a reminder that for all our advances, we hadn't tamed the world. In the decades since, the mystery has been reinterpreted through different cultural lenses. In the early 1900s, it was seen as a tragic accident. In the mid-20th century, supernatural explanations became popular. In recent years, with our understanding of rogue waves and ocean dynamics, scientific explanations have returned to prominence. Each generation finds something different in the Flannan Isles. The mystery is a mirror reflecting our changing relationship with nature, technology, and the unknown. The poetry connection. The Flannan Isles mystery would have remained relatively obscure if not for a poem. In 1912, Wilfred Wilson Gibson published Flannan Isle, a haunting narrative poem that captured the eerie atmosphere of the disappearance. Gibson's poem embedded certain details into popular consciousness, some of which may not have been entirely accurate. But the emotional truth of the poem resonated. It captured the feeling of the mystery, even if it elaborated on the facts. This is another reason the story endures. It's been aestheticized. It's been given literary form. It exists not just as a historical event, but as an artwork, a piece of cultural production that people encounter through literature, and not just through investigation reports. The mysterious and the artistic are deeply intertwined in human psychology. We're drawn to mysteries that feel meaningful, that have symbolic weight, that connect to deeper truths about existence. The Flannan Isles has that quality. The modern fascination with disappearance. In the age of surveillance, GPS tracking, and constant digital connectivity, true disappearance seems almost impossible. We leave digital footprints everywhere. Our phones track our location. Cameras watch public spaces. This makes historical disappearances, like the Flannan Isles, particularly fascinating to modern audiences. Here was a time when you could simply vanish. No trail, no data, just gone. There's something almost nostalgic about that, in a dark way. The idea that you could step outside of the recorded world, that there could be genuine mystery. The Flannan Isles represents a kind of freedom through absence that we've lost. For better or worse, such complete disappearances are harder now. Most unsettling aspects. Let's focus on the elements of this mystery that resist easy explanation. The details that continue to disturb even when we try to rationalize them. The timing of the discovery, 11 days. That's how long the three men were gone before anyone discovered they were missing. 11 days of ships passing in the night, seeing only darkness where a light should be. 11 days of the lighthouse standing empty, its door unlocked, its interior frozen in time. What happened in those 11 days? Were the men already dead within hours of the disappearance? Or did something else happen in that span of time? The gap creates a kind of uncertainty. We don't know exactly when they died. We can estimate it was December 15th, based on the lighthouse going dark. But we can't be certain. Could one or more of them have survived for days after whatever initial incident occurred? This temporal uncertainty is deeply unsettling. The mystery isn't just what happened, but when, and whether their fate was immediate or drawn out. The unlocked door. This detail bothers investigators and armchair detectives more than almost any other. Professional lighthouse keepers were drilled on security protocols. The door should be locked when keepers were inside, and when keepers went outside to work. The only time it should be unlocked was during active movement of supplies. An unlocked door suggests haste, panic, or a situation that developed faster than the men could respond to properly. It suggests the normal order breaking down. But it's also ambiguous. Was the door unlocked because all three men left together and there was no one inside to lock it? Or was it unlocked for some other reason? Some have suggested the door might not have been properly latched and blew open later. Others think someone did lock it, but Joseph Mòr found it unlocked because it had been forced open somehow. But the most likely explanation is also the most disturbing. The door was unlocked because whoever left last did so in too much of a hurry to lock it. That speaks to emergency, to crisis, to something happening that made normal procedures impossible. Donald MacArthur's missing coat. This is the detail that undermines almost every rational theory. Why didn't he take his coat? If all three men left together for a planned task, MacArthur would have worn his oilskins. If Ducat and Marshall left first, and MacArthur followed because he saw them in danger, he might not have taken time to put on protective gear. But would he really dash outside in December in Scotland without even grabbing the coat? The temperatures in mid-December on an exposed island in the North Atlantic are brutal. Wind chill can kill. The spray from the sea can soak you in seconds, and wet clothes in freezing conditions mean hypothermia. Every experienced keeper knew this. Taking your oilskins when going outside wasn't optional. It was automatic, drilled into you through training and experience. For MacArthur to go out without his coat means something happened so suddenly, so unexpectedly, that instinct overrode training, that he had literally no time to prepare, that whatever pulled him outside was immediate and compelling enough that he didn't think about protection. What could do that? What could make a 40-year-old professional keeper with years of experience forget the most basic safety measure? The asymmetric damage. The West Landing was devastated. Iron twisted. Rock torn. Equipment destroyed or washed away. The force required to do that kind of damage is enormous. We're talking about wave impact, measured in tons per square meter. The East Landing, which was lower and more exposed to the prevailing weather patterns, was pristine, untouched. Ropes neatly coiled. Equipment in place. How? If a storm powerful enough to twist metal and tear rock hit the island, why did it only affect one side? Yes, the West Landing faces the open Atlantic, but the East Landing isn't sheltered. A general storm should have damaged both. This suggests something more localized. A single massive wave, perhaps, or some phenomenon that struck one specific location with tremendous force, while leaving the rest of the island relatively unaffected. But that makes the timing problem worse. If such a wave occurred, it would have been a freak event. The chances of three men being at exactly that spot, at exactly the moment such a wave hit, are cosmically small, unless they were there because they saw it coming, unless they were trying to secure equipment specifically because they recognized the danger. But that circles back to the question, why would experienced keepers be outside in conditions that could produce such a wave? The evidence seems contradictory. The damage suggests extreme conditions. The weather reports suggest moderate conditions. The keeper's supposed behavior suggests poor decision-making. But these were experienced professionals. The meal that was never eaten, the table set, the chair knocked over, the cold stove. This tableau suggests interruption. Something happened while the men were preparing for, or perhaps about to eat a meal. Something that caused at least one of them to jump up so quickly that the chair fell, something that prevented them from ever returning. Meals in a lighthouse were important. They were scheduled, ritualistic moments of normalcy in an otherwise harsh and isolating environment. Mealtimes were when the men gathered, talked, maintained their humanity against the grinding loneliness of the posting. An interrupted meal is symbolically powerful. It represents normal life cut short. It represents plans that will never be fulfilled. It represents the fragility of routine in the face of disaster. But it also raises questions. What time of day was this meal? Was it breakfast, lunch, or dinner? The logbook's last entry was on December 15th, and the light went dark that evening. So presumably, the interruption happened sometime on December 15th. But when exactly? If it was the evening meal, and they were preparing to eat before lighting the lamp for the night, that would fit. But we don't know. The meal frozen in preparation is like the stopped clocks. Its time interrupted, life suspended at the moment of catastrophe. What science says, let's ground ourselves in what we actually understand about the physical phenomena that could explain the Flannan Isles disappearance. Rogue wave mechanics. Rogue waves, also called freak waves, are real and well documented. They're waves that are at least twice as tall as the surrounding wave environment and appear without warning. For decades, rogue waves were considered mariners' tales. Scientists didn't believe waves significantly larger than the general sea state could spontaneously form. Then, in 1995, the Draupner wave was recorded by instruments on an oil platform in the North Sea. It was 84 feet high in seas where the average wave was about 40 feet. That confirmed what sailors had been saying for centuries. Sometimes, a wave appears out of nowhere, and it's far larger than it should be. We now understand several mechanisms that can create rogue waves. Linear wave focusing occurs when waves from different directions converge at one point. Wave-current interaction can steepen waves when they encounter opposing currents. And nonlinear effects can cause waves to steal energy from neighboring waves, creating one exceptionally large wave. Could a rogue wave have hit the West Landing on December 15th, 1900? Absolutely. The Flannan Isles are in waters where such waves have been documented. The damage to the landing is consistent with the impact of an exceptionally large wave. The height of the West Landing, about 70 feet above sea level, doesn't rule this out. Large rogue waves can create spray and surge effects that extend far above their nominal height. If a rogue wave hit the cliffs below the landing, the surge could absolutely reach 70 feet and higher. The timing would have to be extraordinary for such a wave to hit precisely when the keepers were at the landing. But extraordinary coincidences happen. That's what makes them extraordinary. Weather dynamics of the North Atlantic. The waters around the Flannan Isles are notorious for rapidly changing conditions. The North Atlantic storm track passes right through this region. Weather systems can intensify quickly. Moreover, the interaction between the open Atlantic and the Scottish coast creates complex weather patterns. Local conditions around an island can differ significantly from the general regional weather. The islands themselves can create their own microclimate effects. It's entirely possible that the Flannan Isles experienced severe conditions on December 15th, even if surrounding areas did not. Weather stations on the Scottish mainland might have recorded moderate weather, while the islands themselves were being battered. This would explain the apparent discrepancy between the weather reports and the damage to the landing. The psychology of isolation. Research into the psychological effects of isolation has advanced considerably since 1900. We now understand that prolonged isolation, especially in harsh environments, can have significant effects on decision-making, perception, and mental health. Seasonal affective disorder is real and well documented. The lack of sunlight during December at high latitudes genuinely affects brain chemistry. Serotonin levels drop. Melatonin regulation becomes disrupted. This can lead to depression, lethargy, and in severe cases, more serious psychological symptoms. Studies of people in isolated postings, from Antarctic researchers to submarine crews, show that even well-adjusted individuals can experience psychological stress that affects their judgment. Could this have played a role at the Flannan Isles? It's possible that one or more of the keepers was experiencing psychological effects that influenced their decision-making on December 15th. This doesn't mean they were mentally ill or delusional, just that the isolation and darkness might have degraded their judgment slightly. This could explain why experienced keepers might have made decisions that seem, in hindsight, to violate their training. The physics of drowning. If the men ended up in the water, either swept by a wave or falling from the landing, what would have happened? The North Atlantic in December is about 48 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, cold shock occurs immediately upon immersion. You gasp involuntarily, often inhaling water. Your heart rate spikes. Hyperventilation begins. If you're not wearing a flotation device, you have perhaps 10 to 15 minutes before swimming failure occurs. Your muscles stop responding. You can't keep your head above water. Even if you're a strong swimmer, the cold overwhelms you. With heavy oilskin coats and boots, the timeline would be even shorter. The clothing would become waterlogged, adding weight and drag. Even the best swimmer would struggle. If all three men ended up in the water, either together or in sequence, they would have drowned within minutes. Their bodies would have been carried away by currents. The North Atlantic waters around the Flannan Isles have strong currents that could transport bodies significant distances before they sink or wash up somewhere. This explains why no bodies were found on the island or in the immediate vicinity. The sea would have claimed them completely. What we can say with confidence, based on current scientific understanding, we can state the following with reasonable confidence. The disappearance occurred on December 15th, 1900, based on when the light stopped operating. Weather conditions that day were rough, but not catastrophically so, though local conditions around the islands could have been more severe than regional reports suggest. The damage to the West Landing demonstrates that at least one large wave or surge struck that location, either on December 15th or shortly after. If the three men ended up in the water under any scenario, they would have died within minutes, and their bodies would not have been recoverable. The most parsimonious explanation, the one that requires the fewest assumptions, remains the official conclusion. The men were swept into the sea by a large wave, probably while attempting to secure equipment at the West Landing. The unusual aspects of the case, the missing coat, the unlocked door, can be explained by the emergency developing in stages with different men responding at different times. Is this explanation certain? No, but it's consistent with the evidence and doesn't require us to invoke anything beyond known physical phenomena. Deeper meaning, beyond the facts and theories, beyond the investigation and speculation, what does the Flannan Isles Mystery tell us about ourselves and our place in the world? The limits of knowledge. The Flannan Isles reminds us that not everything can be known. Despite investigation, despite modern forensic techniques and historical research, despite 124 years of analysis, we still don't know with absolute certainty what happened to those three men. In our information age, where we expect to be able to look up any fact, to reconstruct any event, to know anything we want to know, this is a humbling reminder. Some things remain mysteries, not because we're not smart enough or haven't tried hard enough, but because the evidence simply isn't there. The universe doesn't owe us answers. Reality doesn't organize itself for our understanding. Sometimes, things happen and leave no trace, no explanation, no story we can tell ourselves. This is uncomfortable. We're meaning-making creatures. We need narratives. We need causality. We need to understand why things happen. The Flannan Isles denies us that comfort. The fragility of civilization. 3 professional keepers. A brand new lighthouse built to the highest standards. All the technology and knowledge of turn-of-the-century Britain. And yet, 3 men vanished from a supposedly secure position. This speaks to something fundamental about humanity's relationship with nature. We build walls against the chaos. We create systems and procedures. We train professionals and establish protocols. We convince ourselves that we've tamed the wild places. And then, something happens that reminds us how thin that veneer of control actually is. The lighthouse couldn't protect those men. Their experience and training couldn't save them. The walls and the doors and the rules meant nothing in the end. This isn't to say that civilization and technology are useless. Obviously, they aren't. Countless lives have been saved by lighthouses, by training, by safety protocols. But the Flannan Isles reminds us that protection is never absolute. Security is never guaranteed. The wild places are still wild, no matter how many beacons we build. There's a strange comfort in this, actually. It means the world is still larger than us, still capable of mystery, still fundamentally untamed despite our best efforts. Some people find that terrifying. Others find it beautiful. The nature of expertise. James Ducat had been a lighthouse keeper for over 20 years. These weren't amateurs or tourists making rookie mistakes, and yet something got them. This raises uncomfortable questions about the limits of expertise. We live in a society that places enormous faith in credentials, training, and professional knowledge. We assume that experts know what they're doing, that following proper procedures will keep us safe, that experience prevents tragedy. The Flannan Isles suggests that sometimes expertise isn't enough. You can do everything right and still fail. Not because you were incompetent, not because you were careless, but because the world is fundamentally unpredictable, and sometimes the risks are simply too great. This isn't an argument against expertise. Professional training absolutely reduces risk and saves lives. But it's a reminder that risk can never be eliminated entirely. The universe is probabilistic, not deterministic. Even low-probability events happen eventually. The keepers at the Flannan Isles were likely doing their jobs correctly. They likely made reasonable decisions based on the information they had. And they still died. That's not a failure of expertise. That's just the nature of existing in a universe that doesn't care about our plans. The power of absence. What makes the Flannan Isles so compelling isn't what we know. It's what we don't know. It's the absence of explanation, the gap in the narrative, the missing piece. This tells us something about how human minds work. We're not just pattern seekers. We're gap fillers. When there's a hole in a story, we can't help but try to fill it. Our brains generate possibilities, create scenarios, imagine explanations. The mystery becomes a canvas for our imagination. In some ways, the Flannan Isles is more powerful as an unsolved mystery than it would be if we knew exactly what happened. If we had a body, a witness, a clear explanation, it would be tragic, but closed. The absence keeps it open. It keeps us thinking about it. It keeps the story alive. There's a philosophical question here about whether absence is a type of presence. The missing men are, in a sense, more present in cultural consciousness than they would be if they'd lived long, ordinary lives and died of old age. Their absence has given them a strange immortality, the isolation of existence. At its deepest level, the Flannan Isles Mystery speaks to the fundamental isolation of human existence. Those three men were alone on a rock in the Atlantic. When something happened, there was no help coming, no one to witness, no one to save them. We're all, in a sense, alone like that. We exist inside our own consciousness, unable to fully share experience with others, ultimately facing our challenges and our mortality in isolation. Society and connection can alleviate that isolation, but they can't eliminate it. In the end, we each face the universe alone. The lighthouse was supposed to be a place of safety, of connection, of purpose. The light reached out across the miles, guiding ships, serving humanity. But when crisis came, the lighthouse couldn't save its keepers. The connection was an illusion. They were isolated all along. This is the darkest reading of the mystery, but it's also perhaps the most honest. The Flannan Isles reminds us that beneath all our social constructs, our technologies, our civilizations, we're still vulnerable creatures in an indifferent universe, alone on our own rock, hoping the light keeps burning. The meaning we make. And yet, despite all this darkness, humans do something remarkable. We tell stories. We make meaning. We take inexplicable events and we turn them into art, into literature, into investigations and conversations that span generations. The Flannan Isles Mystery would be just a tragic accident if not for the meaning we've invested in it. We've turned it into a cultural touchstone, a philosophical meditation, a reminder of nature's power and our own fragility. We've made it mean something. This is what humans do. We're meaning-raking machines. We can't help it. Even when the universe offers us no explanation, we create one. Even when tragedy has no purpose, we find purpose in remembering it, honoring it, learning from it. The three lighthouse keepers died in circumstances we may never fully understand. But their deaths haven't been meaningless. They've meant something to everyone who's ever read about the mystery, thought about the disappearance, wondered what happened on that December day. Through our attention, through our curiosity, through our refusal to forget, we've given those deaths a significance they wouldn't otherwise have. Maybe that's the real lesson of the Flannan Isles. Not that the universe is cruel, or that we're helpless, or that mystery will always defeat us, but that humans, in the face of the inexplicable, create meaning anyway. We tell stories, we remember, we transform tragedy into something that connects us across time and space. Three men vanished into the darkness, and we've been carrying a light for them ever since. So what happened to James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur on December 15th, 1900? We've examined the evidence. We've explored the theories. We've looked at what science can tell us and what remains forever uncertain. And in the end, we're left with the most likely explanation. 3 dedicated professionals were overwhelmed by the power of the Atlantic, swept away in circumstances that remain partially obscure, but probably involved a large wave during a routine task that went catastrophically wrong. It's not a satisfying answer. It doesn't explain every detail. It doesn't give us the narrative closure we crave. But it's the explanation that fits the evidence without requiring us to speculate beyond what we can reasonably know. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse still stands on Eilean Mòr, automated now. No keepers required. The light still shines across those dark waters, guiding ships just as it was meant to do 125 years ago. But it does so without human hands to tend it. Sometimes I wonder what those 3 men would think if they could see how their disappearance has echoed through time. They were ordinary professionals doing a difficult job in a remote place. They probably never imagined they'd become part of maritime legend, that their names would still be spoken over a century later, that people around the world would spend hours analyzing every detail of their final day. But that's what happens when mystery meets tragedy. The unknown creates a space that we fill with wonder, speculation, and meaning. The Flannan Isles has become more than just a historical incident. It's become a meditation on isolation, on nature's power, on the limits of human knowledge, on what it means to vanish without a trace. Before I let you go, I want to pose a question, and I genuinely want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you had been the 4th keeper, the one who discovered the lighthouse empty, what would you have thought in that first moment? Would you have immediately assumed tragedy? Or would some part of you have thought there must be a rational explanation, that the men must be somewhere on the island? How long would you have searched before accepting they were truly gone? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this deep dive into one of maritime history's greatest mysteries compelling, consider subscribing to the Obscure Hour. We explore the unexplained, the mysterious, and the strange, always with a commitment to facts, critical thinking, and the honest acknowledgement that some questions may never have answers. Thanks for watching. Do well to like and subscribe to our channel, because this has been the Obscure Hour. And remember, lighthouses guide us through the dark, but they can't always protect those who keep the light burning.